So what is effort in this effortlessness? It's a question that often comes up. And also, in that, why does it seem like there's something to do if there's no doer? These questions come up a lot. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we can actually come up with an exclusive answer. That's one of the trickiest parts about pointing in general, is there is sometimes a sense of confidence that can arise, and pointing is akin to being like a dentist. What we're essentially doing is prodding to see if anything resonates or if anything elicits reaction. And sometimes that can look like some sort of certainty, but that doesn't necessarily mean there is certainty. To be clear, I know some of the videos on this channel might seem like there's a lot of certainty. That's just a presentation. It's just a venue to present. It doesn't necessarily mean it is certain, even if it appears that way. If that pokes and prods something, that is serving a purpose, much like a dentist who is checking to see if there's any soft spots or sensitive spots. And I know that sounds potentially painful, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes that resonance shows up as an experience that's pleasurable. Either way, in this effortlessness, we could say our foundational effortlessness is something akin to sensation and feeling. It just shows up. We could even expand that to be a little bit more specific, that direct experience itself just is. It's just arising. There is no apparent cause. There is no apparent effect. Even if there does seem to be a distortion that shows up in terms of reaction schemas and beliefs and thoughts and narratives, doesn't necessarily impart a sense of cause and effect. That is just the way the mind works. It creates this buffer of time. It creates a cause to an effect to a cause to an effect. And it's very short term, the way that it tends to function. And that short term, and we're talking relatively here in the human experience. Well, how can there be short term if there is no time? It's just the sense of time, the sense that there's a short term, long term experience, the sense that there's a long term, continuous sense of a person and one who maybe has short-term experiences. Really what that seems to come down to is a rising direct experience and then this evaluation machine, the auditor, so to speak, coming in and reflecting, and that creates a little buffering of time. That also will give us a sense of how effort works, because really it finds a momentum through patterning. The personality, the identity, is looking for the most efficient route in order to self-preserve. It's a survival schema. So with all of those pieces combined, we can start to see that really short-term, engaging in a short-term way, in the relative sense once again, is a survival mechanism. It's essentially a no, and it's dependent on achieving something, some kind of outcome. And what happens over time is this identity becomes extremely concerned with these outcomes. And by becoming concerned with these outcomes, it becomes entirely fixated and dependent. What's interesting about that is that those outcomes are actually based on some sort of survival schema. So to be concerned about an outcome is actually to be concerned about survival, and that begins to demonstrate something, because we could say in just a broad stroke that this life, if it's one of survival, will have an entirely different tone than if it's one of something else, something like thriving. So we could say in this schema that the no's tend to be short term, and they tend to be based upon achieving some sort of outcome. And then we could say what that does is that expands itself into a sense of a long-term self. And that sense of a long-term self is really just a combination of these smaller factors, primarily no's, the ones that are rejecting things and resistances, that's creating a long-term sense of satisfaction or predictive nature or expectation or an achievement of something. Hence, awakening, often seen this way. So, collecting all that and kind of coming back to the center here, the question often comes up, well, what about effort? And the trick here is that effort is actually a distortion of that which is effortless. That seems to be the case. that these experiences, these direct experiences, whether they be sensations or something else in direct experience, they are simply arising, and then this auditor wants to come in and do something with that. It wants to change it. It wants to modify, manipulate, alter it in some way. It wants to affect it. It wants to use it as a tool, all in the name of achieving something, in the name of some sort of outcome. Yet, if you've spent enough time in this earthly plane, you see that really there are no outcomes. Like, there's no stopping point, really. They're just artificial bookmarks, just little tabs that we seem to be putting into a continuum that we could just call life. So the essence of effort and effortlessness sometimes can be confusing. Sometimes people say, well, how can there be effort in what's effortlessness? And that is just simply an experience. It's a signal. We could put it this way. Instead of seeing effort and effortlessness as, I've heard this metaphor before, as knots, in that which has effort is a knot, and what is effortlessness is a disentangling of that knot. It's probably more closely connected to something that's a resonant frequency. In other words, to create a resonant frequency, a neutral frequency, sometimes two frequencies of the same, when they interact, they begin to harmonize and they begin to homogenize. So some people will say, well, if I have an effort over here and then I create an effort away from that, then I'm just creating more effort. There's some truth in that, but also at the same time, the experience itself is simply a signal. So why is there effort in effortlessness? It's simply a pattern. Anytime we are pushing against a pattern, we will have a signal. Anytime we're pushing beyond the realm of what the identity is used to handling or with it, what's in its pattern schema, it will trigger a signal. And the signal will be essentially a co-opted sensation. And that signal is noticeable because we feel it, we notice it. We could even look at physical pain in the same way. When there is a sense of physical pain in the body, at its most foundational, at its most primary, that is simply just a signal, an alert. The interpretations and the assumptions from there are entirely up to the mind, but it's just a signal. And the point of a lot of these teachings is to move attention so close to the initial experience that there isn't one there to interpret it as pain or discomfort. And that begins to demonstrate something, that it's all seemingly standing waves and ultimately seemingly collapsing in on itself into something that is foundational and neutral or non-dual. So the effort, the practices, the things that we play with, those are all intended to essentially prod something, to see if there's something there that is an inherent resistance, because if there is, if we take a consistent practice and we have a consistent resistance, we will find identity there. That's it. It's just playing, it's prodding, it's putting out the feelers of intuition. And we could even use a metaphor for this. The mind is excellent at overcasting the mark. It's missing the mark constantly. It almost seems intent on that, but it's also, because the mind is non-intuitive, it's a non-intuitive system, then maybe it just can't hit the mark. Maybe that's just not designed that way at all. So the metaphor we could use is, there's a small pond and a small child who wants to fish in this pond. And they reel back their rod and they cast as hard as they can. And that rod and everything at the end of the line casts over the pond and hits the bushes beyond and misses the water. This is the nature of the mind. The overcompensations, the overcorrections that it makes. And so the small child reels everything back in. And this time they don't open the reel catch, and as they cast it, it stays snagged and the line doesn't come out, and it just swings at the end and they don't hit the water again. The benefit of all of this is simply, as we engage in these oscillations and we are immersed in our lives, we start to recognize something that seems to live in these gaps. The pond itself, as it casts over and back and over and back, we start to have a foundational realization around intuition. This is an intuitive path. There's no question about that. Awakening itself can basically be summed up as an intuition that no one has control of, that demonstrates that there is an intelligence here that isn't an identity. It isn't an isolated person. There's no one here. It's simply a momentum, something. And so to cast over the pond and back and forth, to oscillate in such a way, we start to pick up on the resonant frequencies of this type of intuition. And in that, we start to recognize the nature of effort. Effort is simply engaging with what's being presented and just saying yes as thoroughly as possible. And if we're looking at that short-term and long-term human schema, what we can just call the short-term experience, the long-term experience, we start to recognize that there really is only one fundamental answer to what is. Everything is as it is. That's it. There's not even a should there, but we could say it is as it should be. There is no other option. And so the answer is yes. And in this long-term schema, what we start to recognize is that intuition is a system of yes or a non-system. It is what it is. It is yes itself. Doing our best to keep this in some sort of framework that makes sense. At the same time, there is this auditing mind that doesn't function with intuition. This is why thoughts don't feel. And that mind seems to be primarily concerned with no's. So where the yeses live or where the no's live starts to give us a sense of intuition. We move in this oscillating way, and by nature, we begin to integrate by simultaneously having awareness. As we move into thought and back into sensation, we are casting over and back on the pond, and we are starting to get doses of finally getting the fishing tackle in the water. And that's the whole point here, is that every glimpse that we have is something to be emphasized, because that is the nature of intuition. It is just something that knows without knowing any order of operation of how it knows. It's an obviousness. It's oftentimes looked at this hand itself. Before this is even called hand, there's a recognition of it. We don't know how we recognize it. We don't have an order of operations. It just is sudden and obvious. That is a really powerful way to look at awakening. Awakening is a sudden, obvious realization. And even if it seems to have a gradual sense of unfolding, so to speak, or disentangling, or however you want to look at that, it's still sudden once we recognize it. That's the interesting part here. It's obvious. What is most obvious? And then we start to look at doubts and all these other pieces, and we see how the system of no is attempting to control. No is the first answer to a system of control. A system must have a no in order to then somehow take the reins, so to speak, or to take the wheel. So what is effort in effortlessness? It is simply engagement. It's being distorted, but it is being with what is as thoroughly as possible. And it's a tireless vigilance for that. And what we begin to see is that initially can feel like effort, because this mind has maybe conditioned us to be disassociated, or conditioned us to be checked out in some way, or disengaged. And as we begin to re-engage, there's a signal telling us that something's going on there. And we can call that signal discomfort. We can call it an intensity or a sense of effort. But that doesn't necessarily mean it is effort. That's the trick here. There's an illusion or a distortion taking place. If I could put this in layman's terms, the best way to describe this part is that we want to be comfortably uncomfortable. We want to be so completely and thoroughly engaged that is the new diet. That is our way of life. And even if that doesn't take a tone of comfort or familiarity or disengagement, it will be obvious. The hard truth here is that comfort is a distortion. Comfort is actually numbness. And what we usually call comfort is it's essentially insulated by something. comfort food is a good example. You eat some really heavy food, and all the sensations you feel in the gut are now replaced by a feeling of heaviness resting there. And that is essentially a numbing. We don't want to be comfortable, just comfortable. We want to be comfortably uncomfortable. And that is the essence of this effort in the effortlessness. And then we begin to see that all arising is just as it is, that there's no agent behind it. There's no agent affecting it. There's no one doing it. There's no one taking it away. There's no one imparting change. It's just its own momentum. And there's an intuition in that. So we allow ourselves to cast over the pond and back, oscillate between thoughts and sensations, and we start to touch into a type of intuition that essentially is inherently effortless. And so as you engage, this maybe isn't about disentangling, looking for things to disentangle. See, that's still looking for an outcome, and that's predicating on a sense of no. Anytime there's a sense of no, there's a sense of control. Keep that in mind. Anytime there's a sense of no, there's a sense of control, which will impart a sense of agency, which will impart a sense of suffering. It's all the same. Instead, the answer into direct experience is simply yes. And it gets a little tricky from here because the mind wants to make these rules of thumb that cover everything. Sometimes a no externally to somebody else is actually a yes to intuition. It can get tricky. We let the moment decide. We're not making rules here. We're not living by a code. This is not a doctrine or a dogma. This is tapping into an intuitive sense that just knows what it knows instantaneously in every instant. Spontaneous, immediate. So we can practice some of that. Allow yourself to oscillate, and anytime you get the signal of discomfort, that's a chance that there is an identity there attempting to alert you and attempting to possibly control that experience. So it's in the know that we move. It's right into that sense of effort that begins to reveal effortlessness. It is just simply this way. In these two experiences, the system of yes, which is intuition, and the system of no, they somehow integrate, and we find somehow they are the same. And yet we still walk the path where if it seems like something is exclusive to something else, for instance, non-duality is all inclusive, or we could just call it reality. I guess it doesn't even have to be called anything. It's not exclusive, it's inclusive, infinitely inclusive, to the point where there is no form, there is no resonant frequency. That realization becomes clear. And then when form arises, it's just we could call it a density of experience. And maybe it has a tinge of no just because it exists, but that doesn't mean there's anything to do about it. We suddenly find ourselves moving directly into it, and that's the yes to everything. I am that. It's the same pointing. Yes, 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 something like that. I know this video is probably pretty filled. So if there's any questions, please leave those in the comments, and we will get into that. And as always, very much appreciate all of you for tuning in and checking out the channel. Thank you.